In this news roundup of the week on 29th of April 2022, Russia begins cutting the flow of gas to EU countries that refuse to pay the bill in rubles. Russia also bombs Kyiv while the UN Secretary General was there, as everyone digs in for a long war. Polls show that EU citizens want an elected president, but the bloc is struggling to hold together at all. Also, we look at whether China's failed zero-COVID policy is the beginning of the end of its attempt for world domination, and this week's short thought on why you should be clear about how you measure the success of the things you try to do. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Some weeks ago, Vladimir Putin horrified the EU by demanding they pay for their gas and oil in rubles. Not euros, not dollars, rubles. This was to force those countries to support the ruble, thereby preventing it from collapsing under the weight of the very Western sanctions that those EU countries were themselves imposing. And the initial response was, no chance, never! They pointed out that this was against the terms of the agreed contracts, which turns out not to be a hugely winning argument with someone whose army is currently committing war crimes. And indeed, Russia upped the stakes this week by actually cutting off the flow of gas to Poland and Bulgaria. Now, as it happens, this is inconvenient but not wholly disastrous for those countries, in spite of the fact that they currently import a high percentage of their energy from Russia. Poland said it has contingency plans, has an 80% surplus in stock, and it will not be renewing its contract with Russia when it expires in December this year. Bulgaria has a new pipeline interconnector with Greece that will bring in supplies originally from Azerbaijan, coming online in July. However, some of the other countries do not see such an easy outcome, notably Germany, Italy and Austria. Some analysts are arguing that Putin would be unlikely to pull the plug on those countries that are his biggest customers. Which is kind of easy for analysts to say. The countries concerned seem unlikely to take the bet, given the potential consequences. Germany has estimated it couldn't wholly replace Russian gas before 2024 at the earliest. The German central bank has estimated that the economy would shrink by 5% in the scenario that Putin suddenly cut the gas supply. The EU President, Ursula von der Leyen, tried to apply pressure on them all to hold the line, condemning Moscow's actions as blackmail, saying that anyone who did what they wanted would be breaking sanctions. The exact mechanism for paying, though, could potentially lead them to argue that there is a face-saving loophole. Under the arrangement set out by Moscow, EU energy companies would pay for their gas in euros and dollars, whatever's in the contract, to the financial arm of Gazprom, which would then convert them into rubles. Because that financial institution is actually part of Gazprom, Russia's state-owned energy company, it's a matter of perspective whether they are paying in euros, which then Russia converts into rubles, or whether they're buying rubles to pay for the gas. You have to notice as well that Gazprom's bank was carefully excluded from sanctions by the EU, precisely so that it could pay for its gas. That seems enough of a fig leaf for those in the most desperate dilemma, and that means some of the EU's largest energy companies. So Germany's Uniper has said that it will make payments in euros to an account in Russia. Eni from Italy and OMW from Austria are also preparing to open accounts with Gazprom Bank, according to Bloomberg. Other EU countries are now calling for better guidance from the EU because they want to know whether they will be punished if they follow those companies' lead. All in all, you would probably chalk this one up as a victory for Putin, since he has, at a stroke apparently, divided Europe over its energy dilemma. In the UK, Russian gas is only 4% of energy, although it's still a major headache if it was to be abruptly removed. One thing the country's looking at doing for the short term is to halt the planned closure of several coal-fired power stations that could conceivably be used next winter to help to alleviate energy shortages. The government may give subsidies to the operators to get them to keep the plants in readiness, likely to be in the region of tens of millions of pounds, that will then be levied on consumers' energy bills. Which is kind of ironic, since the anti-net zero campaigners have been complaining about green levies on energy bills, making the cost of living crisis worse. It seems as though soon fossil fuels will be added to that burden. The short-term measure does not, according to the government, change its commitment to have ended the use of coal power by October 2024. That should be a key indicator, by the way, for any green wishful thinkers who might be hoping that the war in Ukraine and the push to get away from Russian gas might mean a short-term fall in greenhouse gas emissions. An analysis for Bloomberg, again, rather confirmed the opposite, that although there is some acceleration in the development of clean energy sources, there is also a lot of fallback to dirtier sources to cope in the short term. Personally, I don't think anyone should be condemning such an obvious necessity. You can imagine that there will be plenty of campaigners who would vociferously disagree. And of course, the war in Ukraine has continued to loom large, with all signs that people are resigning themselves to this becoming a long, drawn-out conflict. This was most starkly illustrated this week in the US, where President Biden asked Congress to provide $33 billion in military aid, more than double the $13.6 billion it got last month. This includes $20.4 billion for security and military assistance, $5 billion for weapons from the US stockpile. The support is expected to last Ukraine until September, on the presumption there are few routes out that are likely to appear in the next 5 months. And it wasn't put forward on the presumption this would be the last time, but instead that it was the transition to a longer-term security assistance. Meanwhile, Kremlin insiders were quoted by the Times of London as saying that Putin has abandoned peace talks with Ukraine and now simply wants to seize as much territory as possible. It quoted an analysis by the Russian investigative website The Bell, suggesting that the Russian economy could sustain the war for 2 more years, thanks to soaring high gas and oil prices. And indeed, Gazprom announced record profits this week, just to underline the point. The Kremlin insiders reported that the sinking of the Moskva warship had damaged Russian pride and convinced Putin to push on with the invasion, since he felt that signing any agreement after that would be humiliating. This was consistent with the comments by the senior Russian commander, Major General Rustam Minakheyev, who suggested that troops could push as far as Moldova, which would fully cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea. Negotiators on both sides identified the uncovering of mass civilian deaths and torture and rape in towns previously occupied by Russian troops as a key factor in the breakdown of substantive talks. On Tuesday this week, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres was in Moscow to talk with Putin and was told that Ukrainian provocations over Bucha were the reason that talks had been derailed. Because Russia still maintains that all those dead people in the town immediately after their forces left, well, they were nothing to do with them. A nonsensical assertion, of course, and investigators have been analysing Bucha and other sites, gathering extensive documentary evidence with a view to ultimate war crimes trials. Such evidence has included gigabytes of video data from CCTV cameras that the Russians didn't think to disable. Ukrainian authorities have filed charges against a first group of 10 Russian soldiers from the 64th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade. When in Moscow, Antonio Guterres said that the UN was seeking to, quote, create the conditions for effective dialogue and for a ceasefire and a peaceful solution. Ukraine was not overly pleased at his trip to Moscow and that message, arguing that it is just an untenable position when one side is using brute force to achieve expansionary goals. A message that Guterres might have received and understood 2 days later on the basis that while he was there, the Russians hit Kyiv with a cruise missile. For all that, there are certainly plenty of costs and consequences piling up on Russia from the current situation. War analysts have examined the evidence for Russia's accumulated equipment losses over the last 2 months and concluded that they have burned through so much of their equipment it would take years for them to be able to re-equip to fight another war. Mark Kansian from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington said that Ukrainian forces have likely destroyed the equivalent of at least 2 years of Russian tank production and 1 year of aircraft production. Russia is thought to have used 70% of its stockpile of expensive long-range precision missiles. And Western sanctions have slowed the rate of that production, at least according to Ukrainian military intelligence. The Ukrainian said that the production of Russia's T-72 main battle tanks had slowed, hampered by the unavailability of spare parts, while production of Russia's next-generation T-90s and T-14 tanks had completely stopped. Western analysts had already noted how Russia has failed to use some of its newer and more sophisticated hardware in Ukraine, and had concluded that lack of spare parts due to sanctions was the key factor. So Russia remains a formidable force with superior numbers on the ground, large amounts of hardware, even if some of it is Soviet era. Ukraine, however, has well-trained fighters who are well dug into positions in key battlefields, with a constant flow of modern equipment coming in from the West. All ingredients for a long, grinding, ongoing conflict. There are no factors that would lead to a rapid conclusion here that would not represent a major surprise and diversion from the expected course of the war. Can Western unity hold up in the face of a long war? Well, maybe if it had stronger leadership in Europe, but what would that look like? A poll by Euroscopia this week showed that a strong majority of EU citizens believe that they should be able to directly elect the European Commission President. Nearly 2/3 of the 1,000 participants backed the suggestion. Now, at the moment, the European Council, which is made up of all members, heads of state and government, chooses the president for a renewable 5-year term. Some have argued that hasn't necessarily delivered stellar results, although the heat on Ursula von der Leyen has died down a little in recent months since the lows of the pandemic. Still, there was huge disquiet when she was appointed around the wholly undemocratic nature of the process. But of course, it's that way for a reason. Once you have a president directly elected by all the people, you have someone with serious democratic legitimacy, with which would almost certainly come increased power. In other words, if you really want to create a United States of Europe, where the nation states become like the states of America, you would create direct elections for the EU executive. Do that one thing and the rest would inevitably follow. It's by no means clear that the citizens polled had fully absorbed the implications of their answers, so would a majority really exist in all the European nations for such a major shift? And if it did, is that the direction the current crop of national leaders want to take it? I think probably not, but well, maybe. But right now they have some major problems that they are trying to solve, and starting with certain of their members who are definitely pushing back against any sort of centralising momentum. So, for instance, the EU is now upping the heat on recently re-elected Viktor Orban in Hungary, threatening to withhold EU funds if he refuses to fall in line on certain democratic governance issues. Politico reported that it had seen internal documentation of the EU arguing that there are grounds to show the situation in Hungary is, quote, indicative of breaches of the principles of the rule of law. These are things like a high percentage of state contracts awarded in single bidder competitions and the funneling of contracts to specific companies. Also, possible irregular auctioning of state-owned agricultural land. It seems the EU will now kick off the beginning of an extended process that could lead to Hungary losing substantial amounts of EU funds. Can the EU fight Russia, albeit by proxy, while also fighting its own members? Some see it as not entirely unrelated if you believe you're standing up for the rule of law against drifting autocracy. A claim that Hungary, of course, completely rejects. Now, if the Council seeks to cut Hungary's funding, it will need at least 55% of EU countries, who between them should represent at least 65% of the EU population, to agree. This is a conflict that has been previously directed at both Hungary and Poland, you may recall. The argument is that the situation in Hungary gives the EU a stronger short-term case. You might also wonder whether Poland's position on the front line of the Ukraine crisis and the way that it's stepped up to that particular challenge has brought it a degree of leeway, at least in the short term. I haven't seen that commented upon at the time of making this video, but you'd have to think that it would be a rather powerful factor. Now, the Hungarian government did not respond to the situation, save to acknowledge receipt of the letter sent to them. Instead, it went on to apparently troll the Commission by talking about how, in line with Orban's election promises, it now needed to ensure that Hungary would A, stay out of the war with Ukraine, and B, make its priority defending children from sexual propaganda. That latter being a reference to its recent measures focused on LGBT issues, exactly one of the flashpoints that had provoked the EU into such a fury in the first place. At least the EU will be heaving a hearty sigh of relief at the results of the French election, which, as increasingly seemed likely in the final week, they avoided having to deal with President Le Pen, whose stated intent was to harry the EU from within. Macron made a bold pitch in his election campaign, saying that the election was a referendum on Europe, and although that didn't noticeably excite the masses, the collective dislike for Le Pen's party remained sufficiently strong for him to get across the finishing line anyway. Since an elected EU president is not currently on the cards, he will resume his ambition to take the dominant de facto leadership role from Germany now that Angela Merkel has left the building, hoping to be able to be the vehicle for Europe to start pulling its weight worldwide. And speaking of geopolitical power plays, are we seeing the beginning of the end of China's dreams of taking the global supremacy crown from America? Some are certainly suggesting so. The discussion comes as China struggles both with its position vis-à-vis Russia in the Ukraine war, but more specifically in its current COVID-19 crisis. In the name of a zero-COVID policy that is wholly associated with Xi Jinping, 43 cities are in some form of lockdown, some of it brutally inhumane, even as the rest of the world is celebrating a return to at least sort of normal. The area under lockdown makes up around 2/5 of China's gross domestic product, and there are serious economic consequences to these lockdowns. But they are also testing just how strong the Communist Party's authoritarian grip on its citizens really is, with the usually all-powerful internet censors, for instance, struggling to keep up with all of the online fury and anguish being expressed by people caught up in the measures. So much so that China's Twitter alternative Weibo has announced that all posts will have their internet location stamped on them from now on, making it easier for authorities to tell who and where the posts are coming from. Omicron is clearly not going to be beaten by even these severe lockdowns, but for Xi Jinping there is no way back. State media has spent the last 2 years weaponizing China's low death toll to extol the virtues of its authoritarian system in comparison with the West, and specifically tying this to Xi's superb leadership. That means to change tack now would be a huge loss of face in a culture where loss of face is massive. So the country is left in the dilemma that it can't abandon a policy that is clearly now failing. There's no pragmatic option of saying, well, that policy worked against Delta, but it doesn't work against Omicron, so now we'll change it. And it gets worse, because his population has only the modest protection of homemade vaccines that are less effective than the Western vaccines. But again, to avoid loss of face, China would only permit its own vaccines. And perhaps because its citizens believe the propaganda about how superior and therefore safer their government's approach was, or maybe because they don't trust the homemade remedies. In any case, a lower percentage of older people have been vaccinated at all. In other words, the same sort of situation we saw in Hong Kong. We saw deaths reach almost 300 a day in March at the height of the Omicron wave there. If that were replicated in China, scaled up by a factor of 200 to match its population, you would be talking about a genuine catastrophe. Hence why the lockdowns persist and why they will be as brutal as needed to avoid the Hong Kong scenario. Xi Jinping is due to have his leadership reaffirmed at the 20th Party Congress in October, a process that was viewed as pretty much an inevitable and unquestionable outcome. That could easily change if things continue to slip out of their grasp. Writing in the UK's Daily Telegraph, Ambrose Evans-Pritchard said that if you add to all that the fact that the West has reversed key elements of its own decline in response to Russia and Ukraine, it was by no means certain now that China's expected rise to unipolar world power status is achievable. China's output has been slumping, not just latterly because of COVID, but also under the weight of debt in its construction industry and the Chinese government's crackdown on the tech sector and other companies that would be expected to be the engines of economic growth. In trying to keep all its potential sources of rival power in their place, the CCP is constraining its own ability to overtake the US. A recent study in China, an International Journal, suggested that China's true productivity collapsed long before COVID from 3.1% in the 2000s to 1.1% in the last decade. And this is key because older powers get weighed down by lower productivity as workers expect higher wages for their wealthy lifestyle and higher levels of debt, as governments get used to printing money as a solution to the growing expectations on them. Emerging powers, however, benefit from high productivity and low levels of debt during their ascendancy phase. But the report observed that China has converged with Western levels of productivity before it has reached that target level of prosperity. And if you add to that the fact that China's population is aging, meaning that its workforce is shrinking by 3 million a year, then you have every likelihood that it has already passed its economic peak. Evans-Pritchard concludes that China could still be the world superpower, but not under the current model and not by lining up as an autocratic front with Putin against the West. There's lots of people who want to make a difference to something, and I would always encourage you to be one of them. Otherwise, why are you here? But one thing I would encourage is that you take things on where you'll know whether you succeeded or not. In other words, how will you know that what you did had the successful outcome that you wanted it to have had? Now, you might think that's obvious, but we do things all the time with no evidence of impact, purely on faith that if we're putting some effort in, well, it's probably making a difference. Let's use the campaigning example, because it's one of the areas where you see the self-delusion at its strongest. I have often criticised some of the campaigners here, especially the Extinction Rebellion types, because in my view their methods and approach are likely to be counterproductive. But how would we know? Short of Roger Hallam's dream of the government being overthrown, there are no demands that are realistically achievable, no campaign goals behind which you can see a theory of how change will be brought about by the actions they're taking it. But when you criticise, people come back with arguments saying things like, their actions have had lots of media coverage, so that's good. Even though the coverage is talking about people disrupting and annoying people rather than focusing on the issue that they're campaigning on. I would contrast all of that with the example of Daniel Lewis. Lewis is a teenager who lives in Wales. He hated the sight of fly-tipped rubbish in the landscape, which was happening in his area at a huge scale. Well, he started work in January last year. He started by taking a wheelbarrow to the common and filling 50 rubbish sacks in 2 days. Now, he asked companies to donate a skip, but he was just some kid, so they told him to sling his hook. So he paid for one himself using savings and some Christmas money. He spent around £1,000 hiring skips to remove the waste. He talked about what he was doing on Facebook, and then companies started to come forward to sponsor a skip and to cover the waste processing cost. A year and a quarter later, he has removed more than 40 tonnes of waste in the last year. 40 tonnes! And he has raised funds to put in place 30 motion sensor CCTV cameras at hotspot sites to catch and deter fly tippers, the feed from which goes through to the council. That teenager made a massive difference to that area, and that's great for the local environment short term. Also a valuable life lesson for him, because he focused on a specific problem, he tackled it with actions in line with actually solving or at least measurably improving that problem, and he will hopefully hold those standards for whatever he decides to do in the future. People who have done things that made a measurable difference tend to be the ones who get very impatient with activity that's just shoveling effort into a big hole marked hope for the best. Now, people will object, sure, that's fine for small-scale projects where one person can make a difference, but climate change is a huge global problem, etc., etc., and indeed it is. Doesn't stop you from being able to identify a measure of success for the bit that you're trying to make a difference to. Now, I used a campaign example. Don't get distracted by that. It's the same for any other thing you do in life. Really, it's about getting into the habit of expecting concrete results, which also means that when you fail to achieve them, first of all, you notice. And that means that you're led to ask what you need to do in order to improve. All right. Now, was that the sort of advice you would expect from, I don't know, a life coach? I don't know. I'm not a life coach. One person, however, who is, alongside a bunch of other things as well, is Karla Joy Treadway, who also has a new podcast on sense making. Karla's based in Canada, was engaged with the Freedom Truckers there in a supportive way. We had a great wide-ranging conversation on her podcast this week, covering all sorts of things, including the ongoing pushback against globalists, how that plays out particularly in Canada with Prime Minister Trudeau, also how the moralistic approach to climate change is pushing towards absolutist solutions that ignore the reality of people's lives on the ground. If you enjoy the content on this channel, you may well appreciate that discussion. It's a great discussion. There's a link to that episode in the video description below. And that just leaves me time to thank, as always, the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Without their support, I really could not do the video content that I do here, nor could I follow the stream of what I believe to be important and interesting, rather than simply following whatever will feed the algorithm best. Now, at this point, I always invite people to join that important and wonderful group, and I do so again because that support really is needed. However, I also point out that we are nearly at the end of the month, and Patreon takes payments on the first of the month. So, to avoid giving twice in quick succession, you might want to hold off joining until Sunday or beyond. Your choice, of course, but if you would like to support the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, you can head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.